Have you ever felt like you're living on autopilot? You wake up, go to work, study, consume, repeat. And deep down, that silent question starts to echo. What's the point of all this? Why keep moving forward if, in the end, all that's waiting for us is death? The world feels indifferent. The answers we're searching for never seem to come. And it's exactly at this point, right in the middle of that emptiness, that one of the most courageous thinkers of the 20th century steps in. Albert Camus, a philosopher who didn't run from these questions. He stared straight at the discomfort of existence and shaped a philosophy that many consider harsh, but deeply freeing. Absurdism. Today, you're going to understand what it really means to live in a world without meaning, and how, even in the face of that, you can still choose life with full awareness and freedom. Does life have meaning? That's one of the most unsettling questions we can ask ourselves. For Albert Camus, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, this question isn't just philosophical, it's deeply existential. It comes from a tension that every human being feels at some point, the desperate desire to find purpose, and the cold, relentless silence of the universe in response to that desire. Camus calls this the absurd, but what exactly does he mean by that? According to Camus, the absurd doesn't exist just in the world, nor is it just inside us. It's born from the clash between the two. On one side, humans, conscious beings, full of questions, craving meaning, justice, explanations. On the other side, the universe, vast, indifferent, silent. A universe that doesn't answer us, that offers no guarantees, that simply exists. In his most famous work on the subject, The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus defines the absurd as the inevitable result of this collision between our human need for clarity and meaning, and the fact that we live in a world that remains opaque and incomprehensible. He writes, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." Notice, the absurd isn't some objective property of things. It's not like the world is inherently absurd on its own. Nor is it just a psychological issue within us. The absurd is a relationship, a constant tension, an open wound between what we long for and what the world actually gives us. And here's something worth pausing to reflect on. How many times have you felt this emptiness? That sense that no matter how hard you fight, search, or strive, nothing seems to offer a definitive meaning. Camus isn't talking about a passing sadness. He's talking about a structural condition of human existence. One classic example Camus gives is the experience of everyday alienation. That moment when, right in the middle of a normal day, you suddenly stop and wonder, why all this? Why do I do what I do? Why am I still living this routine? That strange feeling of detachment from ordinary life is the beginning of absurd awareness. Camus describes these moments with almost poetic force. He talks about a man waking up to the mechanical routine of life, taking the same bus, doing the same tasks. And suddenly, it all feels strange, like he's an actor on a poorly lit stage, lost in a script he doesn't understand. And it's precisely in this moment of awakening that the absurd reveals itself. But Camus doesn't stop at mere observation. He invites us to face this reality head-on, with courage. Because the absurd, though painful, is also an opportunity to live with clarity and honesty. It's interesting how Camus distances himself from other philosophical traditions on this topic. While philosophers like Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, when faced with the absurd, turn to faith or some kind of metaphysical leap, Camus refuses to do that. He doesn't look for comfort in God, nor in any transcendent truth that explains everything. For him, accepting the absurd means not escaping from this tension. And this brings us to one of the most powerful lines from The Myth of Sisyphus. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. With this, Camus suggests that by recognizing the absurd, we can create a new kind of freedom. But that's a topic for the next lessons. For now, it's important to stay with this core truth. The absurd is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be faced. So let's reflect together. Why do humans feel such a strong need for meaning? Is this craving for absolute answers just a cultural inheritance, an evolutionary instinct, or something deeper and more existential? Camus would challenge us to look at that need with suspicion. He'd say, the search is legitimate, but the world was not made to satisfy us. There is no pre-established harmony between humanity and the universe. That's the drama, and, paradoxically, also the beauty of the human condition. One image that helps capture this conflict is the idea of a scream echoing into an endless desert. The scream represents humanity, the desert, the world, and the echo? It never comes. Yet, we keep screaming. Camus doesn't offer easy answers. He doesn't say that meaning will appear if we just search hard enough. On the contrary, he calls us to radical honesty, to admit the emptiness, to recognize that the universe owes us nothing, and that, maybe, it's exactly there that real freedom begins. And what about you? Have you ever had a moment when you felt this absurd tension? When you realized the brutal distance between what you expect from life and what life actually offers? Camus reminds us, this kind of crisis isn't a flaw in existence. It's part of the package. It's part of being human. So before we move on to the possible responses to the absurd, it's essential to embrace this first truth. The absurd is inescapable. It's the starting point for any serious reflection on life, not something to be denied or avoided, but something to be understood. As Camus concludes with his unsettling clarity, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. And that question only makes sense because the absurd exists. We are meaning-seeking beings. Since the beginning of time, humans have refused to accept the world as just a random accident. We search for answers, for stories, for causes, for purposes. We invent myths, create religions, develop philosophical systems, all of it driven by a deep, almost visceral need to give meaning to our existence. Albert Camus, with his sharp and brutally honest view of life, shines a light on this fundamental human condition. In his philosophy, the search for meaning isn't just some intellectual hobby. It's not a side note in the human experience. It's the center of our existence. Camus sees humans as conscious beings, thrown into a world that doesn't share that consciousness. We're the only species that asks, why? The only ones who look up at the night sky and wait for an answer. And that's the heart of the problem. The world doesn't answer. This tension is what he calls an existential conflict. On one side, our hunger for meaning. On the other, the cold, indifferent silence of the universe. There are no secret signs waiting to be decoded. No hidden order behind reality's curtain. Just randomness. The impersonal movement of matter. The blind chain of cause and effect. This realization hurts, and Camus doesn't sugarcoat it. On the contrary, he exposes it with brutal honesty. In the myth of Sisyphus, he writes, "The world itself is not reasonable. That's what is. It has no intention to satisfy us." This sentence sums up the human drama with brutal clarity. We live hoping the world will give us reasons, but the world stays silent. And what happens when we realize this? Here comes the existential shock, that sudden feeling of estrangement, a sharp break from everyday thinking. Camus calls this moment the absurd awakening. Picture this. It's just another day. You're on your way to work, headphones in, going through the usual motions. Everything feels normal. But then, out of nowhere, a question pops into your head. Why am I doing all this? That flash of doubt, that sudden internal shift, that's a small glimpse of the absurd. Camus describes moments like these with almost cinematic imagery. He talks about a man going through his routine, catching the bus, drinking coffee, shaking hands. who suddenly feels like he's watching himself from the outside, like an actor who no longer knows the script. That's an existential crisis, not just a passing mood or a bad day, but a deep crack in how we perceive reality. And here, Camus is blunt. There's no automatic answer to this conflict, no magical solution to dissolve this tension. On one hand, the universe is indifferent. On the other, humans will always crave meaning. This duality is unsolvable, and it's precisely that unsolvability that defines our condition. We are beings of questions, living in a world of silence. At this point, Camus shares common ground with other existentialists like Sartre and Kierkegaard. But with one crucial difference, Camus doesn't see this lack of meaning as a call to despair, nor does he see it as a reason for blind faith. For him, the first step is to face reality exactly as it is. No tricks, no illusions, no comforting lies. This radical honesty defines Camus' thinking. He's not interested in offering you comfort. He's interested in waking you up. Because, as he argues, only by accepting the conflict can we begin to live authentically. And here's something important to remember. This conflict isn't a flaw in human nature. It's not a design error. According to Camus, it's the foundation of our freedom. By realizing that the universe is indifferent, we also realize that we're free to choose how to respond. We can invent, create, and affirm our own existence. But to get there, the first step is recognizing the conflict. Camus writes, "To understand the absurd is to understand the necessity of a constant struggle between human reason and the irrational world. This struggle has no end. There's no final resolution. On the contrary, living means sustaining this tension. It means refusing both escape and resignation." So here's an essential question for you to reflect on. How do you deal with this conflict in your daily life? When you sense the world's indifference, what do you do? Do you look for quick answers? Do you distract yourself? Or do you face it head-on? Camus challenges us not to numb this existential pain with empty entertainment or ready-made dogmas. He calls us to the courage of living with open eyes. In other words, recognizing the absurd condition isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of a journey toward clarity. To live, for Camus, is an act of conscious resistance, a refusal to run away, a refusal to lie to ourselves, a refusal to settle for false meaning. This idea connects to another key concept in his work, revolt, which we'll explore later. But before that, it's essential to fully understand this condition of conflict, because it's right there, in the middle of that tension, that any authentic philosophy of existence is built. So here's a final thought for now. To what extent do you accept the weight of this conflict? And what are you willing to do with this awareness? Picture this: a man condemned to push a giant boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, over and over, for all eternity. This is the story of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology who, according to legend, tricked the gods and was punished with this eternal task. But why did Albert Camus choose this specific image as the central metaphor for the human condition? In his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, Camus takes this old myth and turns it into a powerful philosophical reflection. For him, Sisyphus isn't just a mythical character. He represents all of us. He symbolizes the human being in our daily struggle, in our endless routines, in our efforts that often seem to lead nowhere. The act of pushing the boulder represents all the everyday tasks we do: getting out of bed, going to work, facing problems, paying bills, dealing with disappointments, fixing relationships, chasing dreams, only to wake up the next day and start all over again. Camus forces us to face this image with brutal honesty. He asks, what could be more absurd than this endless repetition? But instead of treating Sisyphus's story as a metaphor for despair, Camus does something surprising. He transforms this punishment into a symbol of resistance and dignity. Throughout his essay, he takes the reader on a deep reflection. If life is a cycle without a final, ultimate meaning, Does that mean it's not worth living? Should we just give in to despair? Camus' answer is a loud and clear no. He insists that even in the face of the absurd, even knowing that the boulder will always roll back down, we still have the power to choose our attitude toward life. And that's when Camus delivers one of his most famous and impactful lines. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This sentence, which closes the essay, isn't an invitation to naive optimism or self-deception. On the contrary, it's a call to full awareness. For Camus, Sisyphus's true moment of victory isn't at the top of the mountain, but on the way down. In that instant when he watches the rock fall again, but still chooses to walk back down, step by step, to begin again. Fully aware of his fate, that consciousness is what transforms punishment into freedom. Sisyphus knows the absurdity of his condition. He holds no illusions. He doesn't expect the gods to suddenly change their minds. He accepts his situation, faces it head on, and in that acceptance, he finds his form of rebellion. Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." In other words, the greatness of life doesn't lie in the final result, but in the very act of living, of fighting, of persisting, even when the universe is indifferent. It's impossible not to relate this to our own routines. Who hasn't felt trapped in a never-ending cycle? Working, sleeping, waking up, and starting over, often without even knowing why. But Camus invites us to change how we see this cycle. Instead of viewing it as a punishment, we can see it as a battlefield where we exercise our freedom. What's at stake here is our inner posture. Camus, in other parts of his work, talks about the importance of lucidity. Living with the absurd doesn't mean sinking into existential emptiness. It means living with clarity, understanding that, even without an ultimate meaning, life is still worth living with intensity and responsibility. By reflecting on Sisyphus, Camus leans toward an ethics of action. It's not the reward that gives value to the struggle. It's the struggle itself that gives value to existence. It's also worth remembering that Camus wrote this essay during a time of global crisis, World War II, when Europe was buried under suffering and hopelessness. Choosing Sisyphus as a symbol was no coincidence. It was a philosophical and existential response to an era marked by pain and unanswered questions. And when we bring this metaphor into today's world, it feels incredibly relevant. How many people are stuck in jobs they don't love, in drained relationships, in suffocating routines? Yet still, day after day, pushing their own boulders, searching for meaning where it seems there is none. Camus would say, even in those moments, there is room for dignity. The challenge he offers is simple but profound. Are you aware of your boulder? Are you pushing it with despair or with rebellion? And here, rebellion isn't about emotional outbursts. It's an inner stance, a silent scream that says, I recognize the absurd, and I choose to live anyway. Camus' philosophy invites us to take control of our narrative, even knowing the script is chaotic, and the ending is uncertain. Like Sisyphus, we can walk back down the mountain with a bitter smile, but with the certainty that every step is ours, every choice is conscious, and every moment of life is, in itself, a form of resistance. When Camus ends his essay The Myth of Sisyphus with the provocative line, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy," he's not just being poetic or ironic. That conclusion is the peak of his entire reflection on the absurd. It's the moment when the tragedy of human existence transforms, through awareness, into an act of resistance and affirmation. But what does Sisyphus's happiness really mean? How can someone condemned to a repetitive, useless, and eternal task possibly be happy? To understand this statement, it's essential to look back at the full philosophical journey Camus lays out in the book. He starts with a brutal realization. Life is absurd. There's a deep gap between the human desire for meaning and the universe's total indifference. That conflict is inevitable. There's no escape. From this recognition, Camus presents three possible responses: suicide, metaphysical escape, like blind faith or a leap into transcendental meaning, and finally, conscious acceptance of the absurd. It's in this third option that Sisyphus becomes a symbol of existential resistance. Camus tells us that once Sisyphus becomes aware of his condition, he doesn't surrender. He knows his task will never end. He knows no God is coming to rescue him. He knows every climb will end with the rock tumbling back down the mountain. And yet, he chooses to continue. The real turning point happens during the descent. That quiet moment when Sisyphus walks back down to the base of the mountain, fully aware of what awaits him. It's in this space, between the fall of the rock and the next climb, that consciousness awakens. Camus writes, "Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable." Here, Camus offers a revolutionary take on human suffering. Happiness doesn't emerge in spite of the absurd, but because of it. The awareness of our limited, fragile, and ultimately purposeless condition is exactly what creates room for a new kind of joy, tragic joy. This happiness isn't the kind sold in commercials or some permanent state of bliss. It's lucid happiness, a joy that comes from directly facing reality, no matter how harsh. Sisyphus doesn't smile because he expects a reward down the road. He smiles because he knows every step, every drop of sweat, every struggle belongs to him. He owns his fight. This sense of owning one's existence echoes a key principle of existentialist thought. Even though Camus didn't see himself as a traditional existentialist, what he's proposing here is an ethics of individual responsibility. By accepting the absurd, Sisyphus reclaims his power of choice. He can't change his fate, but he can decide how to face it. That's the heart of consciously overcoming existential tragedy. Camus invites us to do the same in our own lives. After all, we all have our own rocks to push. It could be exhausting work, illness, personal loss, or a project that never seems to succeed. In one way or another, we're all modern-day Sisyphuses. The difference lies in how we choose to face this reality. We can live as victims of a cruel destiny, or we can choose lucidity and positive rebellion. Camus writes, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn." But here, scorn doesn't mean contempt for life itself. It's scorn for cheap illusions, for false promises of meaning, for the belief that we can only be happy if life is fair or if there's some hidden higher purpose. Sisyphus teaches us to live without appeal, without waiting for a happy ending, without needing a superior explanation. He turns the weight of existence into a continuous exercise in freedom. And this freedom, that's what gives life its meaning. A meaning we create, not one that's given to us. Camus insists that the value of life lies in living it fully, with all its contradictions. It's not about denying suffering, but embracing it as part of the human experience. This kind of happiness is deeply human. It's not fake. It doesn't depend on external conditions. It comes from within. So here's a question for you, the person watching this right now. What's your rock? What struggle do you repeat every day? And how have you been choosing to face it? Camus would say, don't run away. Don't lie to yourself. Don't give up. Look at your mountain with courage. Own your struggle. In the end, Sisyphus's smile isn't one of naivety. It's the smile of someone who fully understands his condition and still chooses to continue. That's the human victory, and maybe the only one that truly matters. When faced with the realization that life is absurd, an unavoidable question comes up. If life has no objective meaning, then why keep living? Right at the start of his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus doesn't shy away from this question. In fact, he tackles it head-on with disarming honesty. He writes, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem: suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. With this statement, Camus puts the issue of suicide at the center of existential reflection. Before asking about God, morality, politics, or aesthetics, the most urgent question is this: is life worth living? Camus acknowledges that for someone waking up to the reality of the absurd, suicide might, at first glance, seem like a logical solution. After all, if life has no ultimate meaning, if the universe is indifferent, if all our attempts to find purpose slam into an oppressive silence, why prolong the suffering? That's the first philosophical temptation, a radical, definitive escape. But Camus refuses to accept that conclusion. For him, suicide is actually a form of giving up on the absurd. It's running away from it instead of confronting it. What Camus proposes is something much more courageous: to live with the absurd, without illusions, without numbing ourselves, without jumping to extreme solutions that cut off the experience of existence. He writes, "To kill oneself is to confess. It is confessing that life is too much for you." And for Camus, that confession is a form of surrender. It's admitting that we can't handle the conflict between our human need for meaning and the world's indifference. But to him, that's giving up too soon. Camus insists that even in a meaningless universe, it's possible to live with dignity. The value of life doesn't depend on some cosmic answer. It depends on our attitude toward reality. By rejecting suicide, Camus defends the idea that life can still be fully lived, even without any transcendent meaning. Lucidity in the face of the absurd doesn't lead to death. It leads to freedom. He says, living is keeping the absurd alive. In this context, revolt doesn't mean anger or rebellion for rebellion's sake. It means not accepting easy answers, not surrendering to despair, not seeking comfort in false hope. It's about holding the tension, staring into the void, and still choosing to live. Camus sees suicide as a choice that shuts down every human response to the absurd. Because by ending your life, you're also ending the only space where that battle against the absurd can happen: existence itself. For Camus, staying alive is the greatest act of defiance against the absurd. Every morning we wake up and decide to get out of bed, even knowing how hard life can be, we're, in a way, saying, "I'm still here." That everyday decision is a powerful affirmation of freedom. Camus also talks about suicide not just as a personal issue, but as a collective, social, and philosophical problem. He recognizes that many people face this struggle because of deep emotional pain, mental illness, or overwhelming social pressures. And it's important to be clear, Camus isn't judging anyone's suffering. What he's doing is reflecting on suicide in a philosophical sense, as a possible existential response to the absurd. He invites us to ask, is ending life the only honest answer to the realization that the universe is indifferent? For him, the answer is a firm no. Contrary to what some might think, Camus isn't a pessimist. He's a philosopher of affirmation, of the courage to live even when all certainties collapse. He writes, "What is a rebel? A man who says no, but refuses to be reduced to nothing." That refusal, that's the first step toward an authentic life, a life that faces the void without hiding from it. Camus proposes what we could call an ethics of continuation, where life's value isn't given by some external meaning, but emerges from the very act of experiencing, struggling, and feeling. For Camus, simply being conscious is reason enough to stay alive, because consciousness is the tool that allows us to turn the absurd into freedom. That's the great paradox Camus offers us. If life has no meaning, then it's free. And if it's free, we can make it whatever we want. But by choosing to live, even in the face of the absurd, we become masters of our own destiny. We can love, create, build, laugh, suffer, all with the awareness that the world owes us no explanations. And this freedom, as scary as it may be, is also an invitation to fully experience life in all its dimensions. So, before considering suicide as a response to the absurd, Camus offers us another path: lucid rebellion, conscious acceptance, and the affirmation of existence. This choice isn't easy. It demands inner strength, and above all, radical honesty with ourselves. But according to Camus, it's the only choice that preserves human dignity in the face of life's biggest mystery. So here's the question for you. How have you been facing your own existential crises? When everything seems to lose meaning, do you run from it or face the void with courage? After rejecting suicide as a response to the absurd, Albert Camus turns his attention to another common path people take when faced with life's lack of meaning: the escape into transcendence, the search for God or some metaphysical truth that might offer comfort. This is the second major temptation when confronting the absurd. If the universe is indifferent and if life itself doesn't offer ultimate meaning, then why not turn to a higher power? Camus calls this move the metaphysical leap. But what does he mean by that? For Camus, the metaphysical leap is a kind of philosophical cheat. A leap of faith, a desperate intellectual move where someone, unable to bear the lack of meaning, creates or clings to a transcendental explanation, even if it's not grounded in reason. The most classic example Camus gives is religion. Throughout history, humans have built belief systems to make sense of pain, suffering, and death. We created the idea of a God who controls everything, a divine plan that justifies even the worst tragedies, and a future life that makes up for the injustices of this one. Camus acknowledges that these solutions are emotionally comforting. They offer relief, a way out of the emptiness. But for him, accepting these explanations is a betrayal of clarity and intellectual honesty. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus especially criticizes philosophers and writers who, after powerfully describing the absurdity of life, suddenly jump to faith as a solution. He mentions figures like Kierkegaard, the father of Christian existentialism, and Dostoevsky, whose novels dive deep into human despair but ultimately land on faith as the answer. Camus respects these thinkers, but calls them out for inconsistency. He says they walked right up to the edge of the absurd, stared into the abyss, but pulled back at the last second. For Camus, that leap is a kind of existential cowardice, not a lack of physical courage, but a lack of existential bravery to face the void all the way through. He writes, "The leap is an escape, a despair disguised as hope." By making that leap, Camus argues, people avoid the hardest task, living without appeals, without guarantees, without promises of eternal meaning. To be clear, Camus isn't making a moral attack on religion. What he questions is the philosophical stance of running from the absurd by clinging to beliefs that can't be rationally defended. For him, the issue isn't whether God exists. The problem is using God as an excuse to avoid facing the weight of existence. Camus' rejection of the metaphysical leap is a radical defense of intellectual honesty. He insists, if we recognize the absurd, we shouldn't cover it up with easy answers. We should hold on to that awareness, all the way to its limits. He states, "True freedom lies in not lying to yourself." And here comes a deeper question. Why do humans feel such a strong need to turn to the transcendent? Camus understands that it's natural. We live surrounded by suffering, loss, and injustice. In moments of deep pain, it's almost irresistible to seek an answer that makes existence feel lighter. Faith can bring comfort, hope, and a sense of ultimate meaning that everyday experience often doesn't provide. But Camus challenges us. Is it nobler to live with a comforting illusion or with an unsettling truth? He chooses the second option. For Camus, philosophical integrity demands that once we recognize the absurd, we stay with it, without sugarcoating reality with transcendental explanations. And that choice, as hard as it sounds, is actually a form of freedom. By not expecting answers from a god or from some pre-written destiny, we become fully responsible for our own lives. This absurd freedom, born from rejecting the metaphysical leap, is both a burden and a source of existential power. Camus doesn't offer promises of comfort. What he offers is an ethics of clarity, an invitation to live with wide open eyes, without illusions, but with the ability to create meaning in the small concrete parts of life, in human relationships, in art, in nature, and in our daily choices. By refusing the metaphysical leap, Camus makes a commitment to concrete reality. He suggests that humans look for meaning not up in the heavens, but here and now, in lived experience. It's a philosophy that demands courage, but also one that gives individuals immense power, the power to take full responsibility for every moment of their existence. Camus concludes that rejecting the metaphysical leap isn't an act of despair. Quite the opposite. It's an act of love for life as it really is, with all its imperfections. And maybe that's one of the most beautiful lessons of his philosophy. We don't need guarantees to live a dignified and passionate life. Life, even if absurd, is still an open field of possibilities. After rejecting suicide and criticizing the metaphysical leap as ways of escaping the absurd, Albert Camus arrives at what he considers the only philosophically honest response: the conscious acceptance of the absurd. This is the most delicate, and at the same time, the most liberating part of his philosophy. Accepting the absurd doesn't mean giving up or living in apathy. On the contrary, it means embracing life with wide open eyes, fully aware of the lack of ultimate meaning, but still choosing to live with intensity, courage, and responsibility. Camus makes it clear, the world isn't going to change, the universe will remain indifferent. The cosmic silence will continue, but our attitude toward that reality can change radically. By accepting the absurd, a person stops looking for comfort in gods, destiny, or metaphysical promises, but they also don't surrender to despair. Instead, they choose to live with what Camus calls fierce lucidity. Lucidity is a key word here. Camus repeats it throughout his work to describe a state of full awareness of our own existential condition. It's the opposite of denial, illusion, or avoidance. He writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "Lucidity is the only value I recognize." Living with lucidity means waking up every day knowing life doesn't come with a pre-packaged meaning, but still choosing to live, love, create, and fight by your own decision. Camus challenges us to take responsibility for that choice, and it requires a deep inner strength he calls metaphysical rebellion. Not a destructive revolt, but an inner stand that says, yes, the world is absurd, and still, I choose to stand tall. This conscious acceptance is, above all, an act of freedom. By acknowledging the absurd, we free ourselves from the illusions that once trapped us. We no longer need to hide behind dogmas, unrealistic expectations, or false hopes. We start living in the present with authenticity. Camus makes it clear that this mindset doesn't erase pain. It won't protect us from loss, frustration, or injustice, but it does offer us a new way to face all of it, with dignity and clarity. This acceptance also invites us to live more intensely. Since time is limited and the future holds no guarantee of meaning, every moment becomes precious. Every choice carries weight. Camus writes, "Supreme clarity can only be achieved through continuous effort." In other words, living with lucidity is a daily task. It's not a permanent state of mind or something easy to maintain. It's a constant exercise in awareness and courage. Many times, we'll be tempted to fall back into old traps. The desire for absolute meaning, the urge to believe in some cosmic order, or the impulse to escape reality with empty distractions. But Camus' philosophy invites us, every single day, to return to consciousness. To remember that even without ultimate meaning, life is still an open field of possibilities. That's the big shift in perspective. Recognizing the absurd isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new way of being, a life built from our own actions, choices, and concrete experiences. Living with lucidity means accepting the vulnerability of being human. It means knowing we don't have all the answers, that suffering is part of the path, that death is inevitable, and yet, still finding reasons to create, love, connect, and even smile in the face of life's tragic nature. Camus also points out that this conscious acceptance opens the door to a new kind of ethics, an ethics without illusions, not based on external commandments, but on an inner commitment to life, to others, and to ourselves. And here comes a fundamental reflection. If there's no given meaning, then we become the creators of meaning. With this awareness, every small gesture gains value. A genuine conversation with a friend, doing your job well, pausing to enjoy nature, all of it becomes meaningful, not because of some cosmic significance, but because it's the result of a free choice in the face of the absurd. Camus puts it powerfully. The absurd man is the one who does not flee the confrontation with the absurd. He lives without appeal. Living without appeal means living without expecting the universe to offer us final answers. It means taking full responsibility for our own existence, no matter how heavy that might feel. This acceptance also protects us from one of the biggest dangers Camus identifies: falling into dogmatism, fanaticism, or rigid ideologies that promise absolute meaning but end up oppressing individual freedom. By living with lucidity, we become less vulnerable to those traps. We start seeing the world with more critical eyes, more attentive, more ethical, and most of all, more human. At its core, the conscious acceptance of the absurd is an invitation to live fully, to not waste the short time we have on illusions or empty despair. It's a choice to be present, whole, alive. So here's the question for you. Do you have the courage to live with that level of clarity? Are you willing to hold the tension of the absurd without reaching for false exits? Camus would bet you do. Because for him, life itself, with all its contradictions, is still the greatest and most beautiful challenge of all. We've arrived at one of the most challenging and at the same time most liberating concepts in Albert Camus' philosophy: absurd freedom. After recognizing the absurd, rejecting suicide, and refusing the metaphysical leap, the awakened human being now faces a new possibility: living without appeal. But what does that really mean? Living without appeal, in Camus' language, means living without waiting for some cosmic justification, without expecting a saving answer, and without turning to gods, destiny, or any transcendent structure to tell us what to do or how to live. It's about recognizing, with maturity and clarity, that there's no higher court we can appeal to for validation of our choices. At first, this idea might sound scary. After all, most people spend their lives searching for some bigger meaning, some external direction telling them what's right, what's wrong, what's worth it, and what's not. But Camus flips that idea on its head. He invites us to embrace this lack of guarantees as a unique opportunity for freedom. He writes, "The absurd man understands that freedom is all that remains." By accepting the absurd, we free ourselves from all illusions. And with that freedom comes a radical responsibility for our own lives. Absurd freedom isn't just any kind of freedom. It's not simply choosing between preset options like picking an ice cream flavor. It's a deep existential freedom that places each of us face to face with ourselves, with the power and the weight of creating our own values. Camus makes it clear: there's no right or wrong imposed from the outside. Each of us must build our own way of being. That means we can choose to love, to create, to work, to fight for justice, to search for beauty, not because we're promised a cosmic reward, but because we choose to, because we give meaning to our own actions. That's the essence of living without appeal, acting from internal decision, not out of metaphysical obligation or transcendent moral codes. Camus writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn." Here, what he means by scorn is scorn for false hopes, for easy comforts, for empty promises of hidden meaning. But a quick warning: living without appeal doesn't mean living without ethics, quite the opposite. By embracing absurd freedom, the individual also embraces full responsibility for their actions and their consequences. It's a freedom that doesn't hide behind dogmas. It doesn't blame outside forces. Every choice becomes real and meaningful, because we know we're the sole authors of our story. And that's exactly why this freedom is so radical. It requires courage, emotional maturity, and a constant commitment to lucidity. Camus often uses the image of a free artist to describe this kind of existence. Just like a painter staring at a blank canvas, the absurd person stands before life. No pre-made sketch, no fixed model, just raw creativity and the responsibility to shape whatever they choose to build. Of course, this kind of freedom also brings anxiety, because along with it comes the awareness that everything is temporary, death is inevitable, and no human action comes with an eternal guarantee of meaning. But it's precisely this awareness that gives life its intensity. By understanding that every moment is unrepeatable, we start valuing each instant much more deeply. Absurd freedom is, therefore, a freedom that affirms life. That says yes to existence, even with all its contradictions and pain. Camus invites us to live with a kind of tragic joy, the kind that comes when we fully embrace the human condition, with everything that it entails. And it's important to point out, this freedom doesn't mean acting irresponsibly or doing whatever you want without thinking. Quite the opposite. It means making conscious choices, knowing there's no cosmic excuse to justify our actions. Living without appeal is living with authenticity, with a personal ethic built from real-life experience. Camus gives a clear example when he says, "The absurd man does not expect anything from beyond. He lives on his own strength and finds, in his effort, his greatest reward." This is a deeply practical philosophy. It's not an abstract theory to admire from a distance. It's a call to action, a call to engage with the world and with the countless small and big decisions we make every day. So here's a reflection for you. Are you living your freedom consciously? Or are you still waiting for something outside yourself to give meaning to your choices? Camus challenges us to stop postponing life, to not wait for a sign from the heavens to start acting. He reminds us that absurd freedom is an ambiguous gift. It's both our biggest burden and our biggest chance to live with intensity. If there's no pre-written script, then the stage is ours. The scene is ours. The words are ours. Living without appeal is choosing to act in life with the courage of someone who knows that the only real audience is their own conscience. And for Camus, that's the noblest way to exist. After everything Camus has laid out so far, the recognition of the absurd, the rejection of suicide, the refusal of the metaphysical leap, and the conscious acceptance of the human condition, one inevitable question arises. Now what? How do we live ethically in a world without meaning? This is where one of the most powerful and inspiring ideas in Camus's philosophy comes in. Revolt as an ethical response to the absurd. But let's be clear, Camus isn't talking about some impulsive, emotional, or purely destructive kind of revolt. This isn't about an outburst of anger or a desperate act. Revolt, for Camus, is an existential stance, a conscious choice, an ethical position in life and against injustice. To understand this better, let's go back to the root of the idea. By recognizing the absurd, the human being realizes that there's no ultimate meaning, that the universe is indifferent, and that no higher power is coming to save us or give our lives meaning. Faced with this truth, we have two options. We either fall into nihilism and despair, or we choose to revolt. Camus writes in The Rebel, "To revolt is to affirm a value." How? And that's the heart of the matter. Revolt is born out of the refusal to accept injustice as something natural, even when we know the universe itself doesn't care. It's as if, when faced with suffering, inequality, and pain in the world, the absurdly conscious human says, "This is unacceptable," even if the universe is indifferent. Revolt becomes an act of affirming human dignity. It turns awareness of the absurd into an ethical force that pushes us toward action. For Camus, the fact that the universe has no built-in meaning doesn't let us off the hook. Quite the opposite. It makes every act of justice, compassion, and solidarity even more valuable. Camus writes, "The moment a man realizes there is no higher meaning, he also realizes that all that's left is to struggle to build human value within that void." This revolt isn't just an individual reaction. It has a collective dimension too. Once we recognize our own absurd condition, we also recognize it in others. Camus reminds us, we're not alone in this existential fight. Every person has their own stone to carry, their own mountain to climb. And that creates common ground for solidarity. So, ethical revolt isn't just a personal cry of resistance. It's also an invitation to build a more just, humane, and compassionate world. But here comes a crucial warning from Camus. For revolt to remain ethical, it must have limits. It can't become blind violence, oppression, or any form of totalitarianism. Camus was deeply critical of political regimes that, in the name of some absolute cause, committed atrocities. He witnessed the horrors of the 20th century, wars, dictatorships, genocides, and he insists, no cause, no matter how noble it seems, justifies denying human dignity. True revolt, according to Camus, is one that affirms life, freedom, and respect for others. Even in the face of the worst injustices, the revolting individual keeps ethics as their compass. Camus writes in The Rebel, "True revolt does not destroy man. On the contrary, it rebuilds him." This revolt is an ongoing commitment, not a one-time act, but a way of living. A decision that needs to be renewed every day, in every choice, in every small act of care and responsibility. It's saying no to injustice, but also saying yes to life, to solidarity, and to mutual respect. Ethical revolt, then, is a way to create meaning within the absurd itself. Not a transcendent meaning, but a human one, built here and now, through relationships, through fighting for justice, and through upholding dignity. Camus calls on us to be active agents of our existence, to not passively accept the conditions we're given, to question, to resist, to act. So here's a challenge for you. How are you responding to the injustices of the world? Are you a spectator or a participant? Are you staying comfortable or choosing to revolt in an ethical way? Camus would bet that if you've made it this far in this reflection, it's because there's still a spark of revolt inside you. And it's that spark that keeps us alive, aware, and responsible. In the end, revolt is an act of hope. Not naive hope that the world will suddenly become perfect, but the concrete hope that, even without ultimate meaning, our struggle for justice, freedom, and dignity makes a difference. Every act of kindness, every gesture of solidarity, every word of resistance is a powerful affirmation of life, made by humans who have chosen not to surrender to the void. This is the revolt Camus invites us to live. And you, are you ready for that fight? The image of the rebel is one of the most powerful and striking figures in Albert Camus' philosophy. After everything we've explored so far, the recognition of the absurd, the rejection of suicide, the refusal of metaphysical illusions, and the conscious acceptance of life's lack of ultimate meaning, Camus introduces us to the person who, even in the face of an indifferent universe, chooses to fight for justice and dignity. But who exactly is this rebel? First and foremost, the rebel is someone who says no, a clear, conscious, and ethical no. A no directed at resignation, at injustice, at oppression, and at pointless violence. Camus writes in his book, The Rebel, "The rebel is a man who says no. But if he refuses, he does not renounce. He is also saying yes to something greater than himself. This yes is an affirmation of life. It's the recognition that, even though the world has no objective meaning, human dignity must be protected at all costs. The rebel knows that their struggle won't change the universe's indifference. They don't believe in future redemption or in some final judgment that will set everything right. Their motivation doesn't come from the hope of a reward, but from a deep sense of responsibility to the present and to others. Camus makes it clear, revolt isn't an act of hate, it's an act of love for the human condition. When faced with someone else's suffering, the rebel feels called to act. Not because they believe in a divine mission, but because they recognize in the other person the same fragility and the same thirst for justice they feel within themselves. This recognition of the other is essential. For Camus, ethical revolt is never individualistic. It's always about solidarity. It grows from a shared awareness that all human beings live under the same absurd condition, and because of that, we should support each other in the fight for dignity and freedom. Camus writes, "I rebel, therefore we exist." This is one of the most famous lines from The Rebel, and it carries huge philosophical weight. It means that by revolting against injustice, the individual automatically acknowledges the existence and value of others. Revolt, then, is a collective cry. But Camus also offers a serious warning. Not every revolt leads to freedom. Not every fight for justice ends in justice. Looking at history, he notes that many movements started with a legitimate desire for justice, but ended up becoming even bigger systems of oppression. Camus is deeply critical of both right-wing and left-wing totalitarian regimes that, in the name of some absolute cause, committed brutal crimes. For him, the great danger of revolt is letting it turn into tyranny. So the ethical challenge is enormous. How do we fight for justice without becoming unjust ourselves? How do we resist oppression without turning into oppressors? Camus answers that the key lies in recognizing limits. True revolt is one that knows its moral boundaries. It doesn't sacrifice human dignity in the name of any absolute ideal. The rebel, according to Camus, never accepts the idea that the ends justify the means. They understand that human dignity must never be violated, even when fighting against injustice. This perspective puts us face to face with an ongoing ethical commitment. Always act with responsibility, fully aware of the consequences of your actions and the lives they might affect. The rebel is someone who refuses both submission and blind violence. They seek a third path, conscious and ethical resistance. Their fight isn't for some unreachable utopia, but for real, concrete improvements, a more just world within the limits of the human condition. Camus writes, "Real generosity toward the future lies in giving all to the present." That sentence perfectly sums up the rebel's attitude. Act in the present with everything you have, without waiting for future guarantees, but always focused on the common good. Here's a question for you to reflect on. When in your life have you been this rebel? In what moments have you said no to injustice, even knowing the world might not reward you with a happy ending? Camus inspires us not to wait for some big meaning before we start acting. He invites us to find value in daily struggles, in small ethical decisions, in the quiet battles we fight every day for dignity and justice. The rebel isn't an epic hero. They're an ordinary person who, despite all contradictions, chooses to stay loyal to life and to others. They know they won't change the universe, but they know they can change how they live within it. And that, according to Camus, is the noblest form of resistance we have. After coming to terms with the absurd, rejecting suicide, avoiding metaphysical illusions, and embracing revolt as an ethical stance, Camus takes us even deeper, to the concept of human solidarity. In a world with no ultimate meaning, where the universe remains indifferent and no absolute truth guides us, what's left for us as human beings? For Camus, the answer is clear and powerful. What's left is each other. Solidarity, in Camus' philosophy, isn't the result of some pre-existing moral system. It doesn't come from divine commandments or universal rules. It comes from something much more immediate, more human, and more real: the recognition of the absurd condition we all share. Camus writes, "Faced with suffering and injustice, a man discovers in the other not an enemy, but a fellow human being." This sentence carries one of the biggest ethical lessons in Camus' thought. Human suffering creates an invisible bond between all of us. When we recognize that life is absurd for me and for the other person, something like an existential brotherhood is born. Not a brotherhood built on dogmas or doctrines, but on the simple realization that we're all in this fight together, each of us carrying our own stones, facing the same silence from the universe. This awareness is where solidarity begins. Camus shows us that even if the universe is indifferent, we don't have to be. Even if the world doesn't care about human suffering, we can, and must, care about each other. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of his philosophy. It refuses apathy or moral indifference. Unlike cold and selfish nihilism, Camus builds an ethics of human connection. An ethics where the value of human life is defended not because of some higher meaning, but precisely because life is all we have. For Camus, the value of solidarity is absurdly human. It's not based on future hope, but on a commitment to the present. He writes, "Real generosity toward the future consists in giving all to the present. That means every act of solidarity we practice, big or small, is a real, concrete way of resisting the absurd. When we help others, offer support, or fight against social injustices, we're making a powerful statement. That human life deserves to be defended, even if the universe stays silent." Camus witnessed this kind of solidarity firsthand during some of the darkest moments in history: wars, revolutions, collective tragedies. He noticed that even when everything seemed lost, humans still reached out to each other. This absurd solidarity is one of our greatest acts of resistance against existential emptiness. It reminds us that even if the world doesn't offer meaning, we can build meaning through human relationships. Camus describes the rebel as someone who, when saying no to injustice, meaningless suffering, and oppression, is also saying yes to a life lived together with others. He makes it clear, there is no true revolt that doesn't include care for the other. Solidarity isn't a side note. It's a natural consequence of a philosophy that chooses life, dignity, and justice as fundamental principles, even in a universe without ultimate purpose. And here's a deep question. If we're all condemned to live and die without metaphysical guarantees, what value could be more important than caring for one another? Camus doesn't offer easy answers. He doesn't tell us exactly what to do in every situation. His ethics are open-ended, built on personal awareness and responsibility. But he makes one thing clear: turning your back on another person's suffering is a betrayal of the human condition. This absurd solidarity is also a form of freedom. When we choose to help, support, and protect others, we're exercising our most authentic freedom. The freedom to act with humanity, even knowing the universe won't reward us for it. And maybe this is one of the greatest displays of inner strength, acting ethically without expecting anything in return, simply because we recognize ourselves in the other person. Camus ends The Rebel with a call for moderation, balance, and respect for life. He acknowledges the limits of human action, but insists that within those limits, there's an enormous space for solidarity, for building a more just and dignified world. He writes, "If there is a sin against life, it consists perhaps not so much in despairing of life as in hoping for another life, and in eluding the implacable grandeur of this one." So here's a final thought for you to reflect on. How have you practiced solidarity? What acts of care, empathy, and justice have you chosen, knowing that the universe won't applaud you for it? Camus reminds us that the real meaning of life might just be this: choosing, consciously, to care for others, to fight injustice, to affirm human dignity, even in the middle of the absurd. This is absurd solidarity, and maybe it's the most beautiful and honest way to live. Throughout his work, Albert Camus invites us to take a conscious and ethical stance of revolt in the face of the absurd. But precisely because he defends a lucid and responsible form of revolt, he feels the need to draw a very clear line. Revolt should never turn into blind violence or be used to justify killing in the name of absolute causes. In his book The Rebel, published in 1951, Camus dives deep into this issue, offering a sharp critique of what he calls violent nihilism. But what exactly does he mean by that? Violent nihilism is the extreme stage of denial, where a person, after realizing that life has no ultimate meaning, starts to believe that anything goes, including the destruction of other lives for the sake of an ideal. Camus carefully analyzes some of the major revolutionary movements in modern history that, while starting with real struggles against injustice, ended up becoming totalitarian and murderous regimes. He looks at political revolutions, dictatorships, and movements that, in the name of justice, committed even greater injustices. For Camus, this shift from ethical revolt to absolute violence happens when people abandon moral boundaries. He writes, "The rebel, by refusing injustice, must also refuse to create new injustice." The big danger, according to Camus, is that once we lose sight of ethical limits, we begin to justify any means to achieve an idealized end. And it's exactly at this point that revolt, which once affirmed life, turns into a denial of our shared humanity. Camus strongly criticizes the logic of those who say, in order to achieve future justice, we're allowed to commit injustices today. For him, this is a dangerous trap, turning the fight for freedom into new forms of oppression. Camus uses real historical examples: the excesses of the French Revolution, the crimes committed in the name of the Russian Revolution, and the totalitarian practices of both fascist and communist regimes. He doesn't hold back criticism, not toward the right, not toward the left. His loyalty is to human life, to dignity, to unconditional respect for others. He writes, "When a man justifies murder in the name of an ideal, he kills not only the other person, but also a part of his own humanity." This is Camus's central warning against violent nihilism. He understands that the fight for justice is legitimate and necessary, but he insists the means must match the ends. We can't kill in the name of future freedom. We can't oppress in the name of some utopia. For Camus, the ethics of revolt is an ethics of limits. The rebel recognizes that their freedom ends where the other person's freedom begins. No ideal, no matter how noble it sounds, gives us the right to take another human life. Camus stands firmly against the philosophy of everything is permitted, a belief often misrepresented in some distorted interpretations of nihilism. For him, if life has no ultimate meaning, that doesn't give us a free pass to destroy. On the contrary, it makes our moral responsibility even greater. He writes in The Rebel, "Unrestrained freedom leads to chaos. Revolt without limits leads to crime." This balance between revolt and ethics is one of the most delicate and most brilliant aspects of Camus' thought. He doesn't fall into the naivety of preaching passive peace in the face of injustice. He fully recognizes the need for resistance, for struggle, for social transformation. But at the same time, he never gives up on the absolute value of human life. Camus warns, the price of a revolution that forgets moral limits is the loss of our very humanity. This critique, written during the political tensions of the 20th century, feels disturbingly relevant today. How often do we still see political movements justifying violence in the name of some so-called greater good? How many movements start with real ideals of justice, but end up drowning in intolerance, authoritarianism, and cruelty? Camus calls us to constant vigilance. Any revolt that strays from ethics becomes its own opposite. And here's a necessary question for self-reflection. In our own daily battles, are we respecting these limits? Or do we sometimes let ourselves get carried away by anger, by the desire for revenge, by the urge to impose our worldview on others? Camus proposes a revolt that affirms life, that respects others, and that recognizes the unique value of every human being. A revolt that knows how to say no to injustice, but also no to unchecked violence. At its core, Camus' greatest teaching is this: even in the face of the absurd, human dignity must remain our non-negotiable ethical boundary, because if we lose that, we lose everything. Throughout his work, Albert Camus builds a philosophy of clarity and awareness. For him, consciousness isn't just a human trait, it's an ongoing act of resistance, a way of refusing to be swallowed up by the absurd, by despair, or by illusion. Clear and conscious awareness might be one of the most powerful tools we have in the face of an indifferent universe. But what exactly does Camus mean by this? First, it's important to remember that the absurd, according to Camus, is born from the clash between two forces: our human desire for meaning and the silence of the world. Faced with this realization, many people choose to run away. They numb themselves with distractions, dive into comforting beliefs, or simply live on autopilot. acting as if the question of life's meaning doesn't even exist. Camus rejects all these forms of escape. For him, the most dignified path is something else entirely: to stay conscious, even when it hurts. He writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "What is a lucid man? It's someone who, when facing the absurd, refuses both blind hope and total despair. He stands tall, fully aware of his condition." This kind of awareness for Camus isn't easy. It's a daily effort. It's not some permanent state of enlightenment. It's a continuous exercise in paying attention. Living with clear awareness means looking at reality without filters, without hiding behind excuses, dogmas, or comforting illusions. It means recognizing the lack of ultimate meaning and still choosing to act, to love, to create. For Camus, this conscious stance is, in itself, an act of resistance against the absurd. The world may be indifferent, but we don't have to be. Clear awareness keeps us connected to the value of life, to the dignity of others, and to the importance of each choice we make. It stops us from falling into the mindless routine of daily life. Camus describes the lucid person as someone who, every morning, wakes up and consciously recognizes the weight of the absurd, but still chooses to live with integrity. This daily repetition of choosing to live with awareness is what he calls fidelity to life. And this fidelity is one of the greatest forms of existential courage. Camus writes, "Total clarity is a difficult path, but it's the only one that allows us to live truthfully." So what does it mean to be lucid? It means choosing truth, not some absolute, universal, or metaphysical truth, but the truth of our own condition. It's understanding that suffering exists, that death is inevitable, that injustice is real, but also realizing that, even within these limitations, there's space for joy, for creativity, and for ethical commitment to the world and to others. Clear awareness is also a powerful antidote to fanaticism. Camus points out that many of humanity's greatest tragedies happened when people gave up on awareness in favor of some absolute ideology. When someone believes they hold the one and only truth with a capital T, they risk justifying any action in the name of that supposed truth. Persecution, wars, even murder. Lucidity, in contrast, keeps us humble. It reminds us that we don't have all the answers, that our worldview is limited, and that others are fighting their own battles with the absurd. This awareness of human limits makes us more ethical, more careful, and more mindful of the value of life. Living with awareness also means living in the present. Camus insists that a lucid person doesn't stay stuck in the past or obsessed with some idealized future. They understand that the only real time we have is now, and it's in the now that we make our choices, build our values, and exercise our freedom. This focus on the present is both a political, ethical, and existential act. Camus writes, "The only possible freedom is the one we exercise at every moment." That sentence sums up the spirit of clear awareness. A freedom lived moment by moment, grounded in real, concrete choices, even while knowing the universe remains silent. Another key point: lucidity doesn't block joy. In fact, it makes joy more real. Camus talks about a tragic joy that comes directly from facing the absurd with courage. By accepting life as it is, with all its pain and contradictions, the lucid person can experience a deeper, more authentic happiness, a joy that doesn't depend on illusions, but grows from the raw courage of being alive. Camus invites us to cultivate this awareness as a daily act of resistance. He knows there will be moments of exhaustion, discouragement, and the temptation to run away, but he insists, keep coming back to awareness, keep coming back to clarity, because at the end of the day, it's this clear and conscious awareness that allows us to live fully, responsibly, and with real freedom. So here's the question for you. Are you living with awareness? Are you making your choices consciously? Are you acknowledging the absurd and still choosing to go on with dignity and courage? Camus would probably say this: if you're even asking yourself these questions, you're already on the right path. After walking the entire path of absurd awareness and ethical revolt, Albert Camus introduces one of the most beautiful and perhaps most inspiring aspects of his philosophy, the aesthetics of existence. By recognizing that life has no ultimate meaning, Camus doesn't invite us to despair, but to a new way of appreciating life itself. He calls on us to find beauty in the fleeting, in the everyday, in the small experiences we often overlook. For Camus, art, nature, and simple pleasures are ways of affirming life in the face of the absurd. In his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, he writes, "If the world has no meaning, that invites me to live, and to create my own meaning." Here, artistic creation becomes a powerful response to the void. For Camus, art isn't just a hobby or a luxury for the few. It's an act of resistance. A way to confront the absurd with beauty. The artist, when looking at the chaos of the world, chooses to create order, form, and meaning, even knowing it's all temporary. Camus, being a novelist, playwright, and essayist, lived this aesthetic of existence in practice. His own literary works are a living example of how creation can become an act of affirmation. He believed that every painted canvas, every written poem, every composed song was a human cry against the silence of the universe. But the aesthetics of existence go beyond formal art. Camus also invites us to find meaning in life's simple pleasures. The smell of the sea on a summer morning, the golden light of late afternoon, the taste of hot coffee, the touch of someone you love. In many parts of his books, Camus describes nature scenes, moments of physical pleasure, and brief moments of pure contemplation. These small, often fleeting moments, according to him, are acts of resistance against the absurd. Living the aesthetics of existence means learning to value the now. It's understanding that time is limited, and precisely because of that, every moment can be lived with intensity. Camus challenges us to look at the world with more attention, to develop an aesthetic eye, not just for great works of art, but for everyday life. He writes, "Beauty is unbearable. It drives us to despair. It forces us to act." This sentence shows the power that aesthetic experience has to shake us out of inertia, to make us feel alive, and to push us toward action. Camus saw beauty as a call to action, a reminder that life, even if absurd, is still full of moments worth living and celebrating. And this aesthetic of existence is not about escaping reality. It's about diving deeper into it, being fully present. It's about looking at a landscape, a piece of art, or someone's smile and saying, "Yes, life is hard, it's limited, it's absurd, but it's still beautiful." Camus had a special connection with nature. He often talked about the light of Algeria where he grew up, the beaches, the fields, the sunlit cities. For him, just feeling the sun on his skin was already an act of life affirmation. He writes, "In the middle of winter, I finally learned that within me there was an invincible summer." This quote, so often shared, is a perfect summary of Camus' aesthetics of existence. Even in our hardest moments, even in suffering, there's a part of us that can still feel joy, still notice beauty, still affirm life against all odds. The aesthetics of existence is also an exercise in humility. It teaches us that we don't need big achievements or ultimate answers to live well. We just need to be present, to allow ourselves to feel, to make room for contemplation, for laughter, for a hug, for the small details that can turn an ordinary day into a moment of eternity. So here's a question for you. In the last few days, how many times have you stopped to notice the beauty around you? How often have you taken a deep breath and felt grateful for a simple, real moment? Camus invites us to do exactly that. He reminds us that in the face of the absurd, our greatest weapon is the ability to create, to feel, and to live each second with intensity. The aesthetics of existence is, at its core, an invitation to joy. Not naive joy that ignores suffering, but clear-eyed, conscious joy that knows pain exists and still chooses to smile. Camus teaches us that even without an ultimate meaning, life can still be a worthy spectacle. A spectacle full of colours, sounds, flavours, emotions, and human connection. And the choice to fully live this spectacle is ours alone. One of the biggest and most surprising lessons in Albert Camus' philosophy is this: it's possible to be happy, even in an absurd world. After everything we've covered so far, recognizing the lack of ultimate meaning, rejecting suicide, refusing metaphysical illusions, accepting the human condition, and choosing ethical revolt, Camus introduces one of his most deeply human and emotional concepts: tragic joy. But what does that really mean? Tragic joy is the ability to find happiness, not in spite of the absurd, but through it. It's a kind of happiness that doesn't ignore pain, suffering, or the inevitability of death. It's a happiness that comes exactly from facing these realities head-on and with open eyes. Camus writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. We must imagine Sisyphus happy." Here, Camus concludes that Sisyphus's endless struggle, despite seeming pointless, can still be lived with joy. And why is that possible? Because humans have the power to choose their attitude toward life. Even knowing the world offers no ultimate meaning, we can decide to create our own meanings, live with intensity, and embrace each moment fully. This kind of tragic joy isn't shallow emotion. It's not naive optimism. It's a form of emotional clarity, a way of living that fully acknowledges the weight of existence and still chooses to celebrate life. Camus believed that by accepting the absurd, we become free. Free from unrealistic expectations, false promises, and illusionary hopes. And in that freedom, a new source of joy is born. The ability to be present, to feel, to create, to love, even knowing it's all temporary. This is a deeply ethical kind of happiness, because it carries with it the responsibility to choose life, day after day. Camus describes the absurd person as someone who lives with full awareness of their condition and still says yes to life. He writes, "Life must be lived with passion, with the intensity of those who know there's no second chance." That awareness of finitude gives the present moment a kind of importance we often forget in daily life. When we know there are no guarantees, no later, where some cosmic justice will fix everything, we start to value the here and now so much more. Tragic joy is the ability to laugh, even knowing we're walking toward death. It's the pleasure of a hot coffee on a cold morning, the relief of an honest conversation with a friend, the quiet awe of watching a sunset. It's the conscious choice to embrace the fleeting beauty of life, without needing transcendental justifications. Camus also draws an interesting parallel between tragic joy and art. For him, an artist is someone who transforms human suffering into beauty, into expression, into resistance. And the same goes for any person who, when faced with the absurd human condition, chooses to create moments of meaning, whether by building a friendship, fighting for justice, or simply living with dignity. Tragic joy, then, is a continuous act of creation. It invites us to live each day as an unfinished project, where we choose our own values, our own passions, and our own paths. Camus doesn't deny suffering. He doesn't romanticize pain. What he does is remind us that even in the middle of suffering, life still offers moments of joy, laughter, and fullness, and that to deny those moments is to waste the little time we have. This philosophy challenges us to stop playing the victim of existence, to take an active, creative, and responsible stance, to turn the weight of the absurd into fuel to live better. Camus writes, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. That freedom includes the freedom to be happy, to find joy even in the middle of tragedy, to laugh even knowing the laughter won't last, to love even knowing love is finite, to create even knowing it will all eventually be forgotten. That's the beauty of tragic joy. It doesn't need eternity to be real. It's built in the present moment, in the here and now, through conscious choice. Camus invites us to look at life with more generous, attentive, and open eyes, ready to enjoy the simple fact of being alive. So here's a question for you. Have you allowed yourself to live this tragic joy? Have you found reasons to smile, even knowing the world owes you no explanations? Camus believed that if your answer is yes, then you're already resisting the absurd in the most courageous way possible, with joy. In Albert Camus's philosophy, the present moment holds a central place. After going through the whole journey of facing the absurd, rejecting false escapes, and consciously accepting the human condition, one inevitable conclusion appears. The only time that truly belongs to us is now. Camus doesn't say this as some motivational catchphrase or feel-good cliché. For him, this realization is a logical result of understanding the absurd. If the universe is indifferent, if there's no guaranteed ultimate meaning, and if the future remains a total mystery, then living in the present isn't just a choice, it's an existential urgency. He writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "Real generosity toward the future consists in giving all to the present." That line captures one of the most beautiful lessons in Camus' philosophy. The present is the only real time we have. The past is already gone. We can't change it. The future is just a possibility, a promise that might never happen. Camus invites us to step away from the mental traps that keep us living for later. When I get that job, when I move, when things finally get better, he reminds us that later may never come. And while we wait, life is happening right now. Now, this urgency to live in the present doesn't mean living recklessly or without responsibility. On the contrary, it means living more consciously, more attentively, more fully. It's about truly being present in every choice, every relationship, and every small, everyday pleasure. Camus believed that recognizing life's fragility makes us value each moment even more. This awareness of impermanence helps us see that every morning, every conversation, every sunset is a unique chance to affirm life. Here, Camus connects with other philosophical traditions that also value the present, like ancient Stoicism or even parts of Buddhism. But the difference is, Camus reaches this focus on the now through the lens of the absurd, not through any spiritual system or religious doctrine. For him, the urgency to live the present comes from the clear understanding that there are no future promises to save us from the void. This consciousness shifts how we relate to time. How often do we put off important decisions? How often do we avoid real experiences out of fear, insecurity, or waiting for the perfect moment? Camus challenges us. What if the perfect moment is now? Betting everything on the present is an act of courage. It's choosing to act, love, create, and fight, even knowing tomorrow is uncertain. It's putting real energy into human relationships, into work, into art, into small moments of joy, without expecting the universe to reward us for it. Camus writes, "The absurd man is the one who lives without appeal, who doesn't bet on a future that may never come." This attitude takes constant awareness, because it's easy to fall back into the habit of postponing happiness. It's easy to delay life. But Camus calls us to do the opposite, to live with intensity whatever is within reach right now. That doesn't mean living without plans or ignoring responsibilities. It simply means recognizing that the only time we have any real control over is now. Living in the present also means accepting its pains, its losses, its contradictions. It's not about only living for the happy moments. It's about living all of it, fully. Camus describes the lucid person as someone who doesn't run from even the hard experiences, because they understand those too are part of existence. He recognizes that in the face of the absurd, every second of life is an act of resistance. This urgency for the present is also a form of ethics. By fully living the now, we become more responsible for our actions, more aware of how we affect others, and more committed to building a life that's just and meaningful. Camus observes that many of history's worst injustices came from utopian projects that sacrificed the present for an idealized future. That's why he defends an ethics of the present. We can't justify present suffering with promises of some future happiness that may never come. So ethical responsibility, in Camus' view, also means living today well. And here, Camus leaves us with a powerful question. How have you been living your days? Are you truly present in your choices? Or have you been putting your own life on hold, waiting for an uncertain future? Living in the present isn't about being reckless. It's about being authentic. It's about choosing to live honestly, knowing that every moment matters. It's a call to action, to creation, to love. It's understanding that we don't need cosmic meaning to value what's in our hands right now. Camus teaches us that the present is the only space where freedom can truly exist, because the past is unchangeable, and the future is unreachable. All we have is this instant, this moment, this choice, and from that awareness, we can build a fuller, more ethical, and more truthful life. So here's the final reflection. What will you do with the now that you've been given? Camus would say, live with courage, live with clarity, live fully, because now is all there is. Talking about the absurd can sound overly philosophical, almost like a conversation far removed from real life. But Camus never wanted his philosophy to be some cold theory locked away in books and academic lectures. What he offers is a philosophy to be lived and felt, a philosophy that walks alongside us in everyday life. After realizing that the universe is indifferent, that life doesn't offer any ultimate meaning, and that we're thrown into a world with no final answers, Camus doesn't leave us paralyzed. Quite the opposite. He invites us to act, to create, to love, to resist, to live the absurd in real, tangible ways, with everything we've got. But how do we actually do that in practice? Camus points to a few paths that are, above all, deeply human. Work, art, friendship, and love. They're not magical solutions or ready-made formulas, but real ways to respond to the absurd condition of existence. How many times have you caught yourself thinking that your daily work feels mechanical, exhausting, or even pointless? That feeling is very close to the image of Sisyphus, the figure Camus chose as the central metaphor for our condition, pushing a stone up a hill every day, only to watch it roll back down. Sound familiar? But Camus teaches that the value of work isn't in the final result, which is almost always temporary. It's in the act itself, in the effort, in being fully present during the task. When we work with awareness, with engagement, with attention to the moment, even the most repetitive tasks can become acts of resistance and dignity. He writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." So work doesn't have to be seen as punishment. It can be a daily chance for affirmation, for presence, and for creating meaning. Even if temporary, it's still real. If the world doesn't hand us ready-made meaning, then we create our own. That's exactly what artists do. Camus, as a writer, playwright, and journalist, lived this intensely. For him, art is a powerful answer to the absurd, a way to bring form to chaos and build beauty where there was only silence. Painting, writing, composing, acting. These are ways of shouting to the world, "I'm here. I see the absurd, but I choose to create anyway." Art, according to Camus, doesn't need to seek universal truths. It's free to explore contradictions, impermanence, tragedy, and beauty. Every work of art is an affirmation of life, a refusal to stay silent. He says, to create is to live twice. Meaning, when we turn emotions, experiences, even suffering into art, we double our existence, becoming both the one who lives and the one who transforms life into creation. Camus saw friendship as one of the most authentic forms of resistance to the absurd. When we recognize our own limited condition, we also recognize that others are fighting the same battle. This shared awareness creates a deep sense of solidarity. Friendship, then, isn't just a social bond. It becomes an existential pact, taking care of each other, offering support, laughing together, crying together. All of this gains deeper value when we understand that time is short and no one has all the answers. Camus says that ethical revolt is only real when it includes others. That's why friendship is also a form of collective resistance, a way to affirm that, even without ultimate meaning, human life is still worth care and affection. Few things require more courage than loving in an absurd world. Camus knew this well. Love, for him, isn't some idealized, romanticized feeling. It's a daily choice, a conscious act of giving, knowing that everything is temporary and the end is inevitable. But it's precisely this awareness of impermanence that makes love so intense and so real. Loving, even though we know we might lose. Loving even though we know the other person is just as fragile as we are. Loving without expecting promises of forever, but fully embracing each moment of connection, presence, and care. Camus teaches that love is a form of revolt against the absurd. He writes, "The absurd man loves with all his strength, even knowing everything is temporary. This is a way to love with more truth, more presence, and fewer illusions, beyond work, art, friendship, and love." Camus invites us to find joy in life's small pleasures, a swim in the sea, the taste of strong coffee in the morning, the smell of wet earth after rain, a friend's unexpected laughter. These small, often overlooked moments are real ways to say yes to life, even knowing it offers no guarantees. Camus saw in nature, music, and honest conversation quiet but powerful forms of resistance to the absurd. In all these ways of living with the absurd, there's one thing in common: a conscious choice not to waste life. Camus invites us to be fully present in every moment, not to postpone happiness, not to use the lack of meaning as an excuse for inaction, but to build every day a life that, though it may not have ultimate meaning, is still full of presence, intensity, and dignity. So here's a final challenge. How are you responding to the absurd? What are the real, concrete ways you're affirming life every day? Camus would remind us, don't wait for a bigger meaning. Live, choose, create, love right now. There are no more excuses, no cosmic guarantees, no promises of salvation. When a person wakes up to the reality of the absurd, a new kind of responsibility hits with almost brutal force. The responsibility to create your own meaning in a world that offers none. Albert Camus, with his trademark clarity, calls this moment living without appeal. This isn't some soft metaphor, it's a precise existential diagnosis. Living without appeal means accepting, in the most radical way, that there's no higher authority we can turn to when we face the void, suffering, or moral doubt. There's no metaphysical courtroom, no universal judge validating or condemning our choices. We're each, completely and utterly, alone with our own freedom and our own responsibility. Camus writes, "The absurd man is the one who recognizes his condition and still chooses to live without expecting a solution from outside himself." This is one of the biggest turning points in Camus's philosophy. Where many people used to look for a foundation for their decisions in God, fate, or some absolute moral law, Camus flips the script. The human being must become the foundation for their own choices. At first glance, this total freedom might feel like an unbearable burden. Without some ultimate meaning to organize life, without a universal promise of justice, it's up to us to decide what to do with every second we're given. But Camus doesn't see this as a tragedy. To him, this absence of appeal is exactly what gives us a unique opportunity, the chance to live with integrity, with authenticity, and with real freedom. By choosing to live without appeal, We stop playing the victim of circumstances or the lost creature searching for external meaning. We become the agents of our own lives, the authors of our own values, the builders of our own projects. This is what true personal responsibility looks like. Not just making choices, but fully owning the consequences of those choices. Camus makes it clear. This freedom is not an invitation to selfishness or irresponsibility. Quite the opposite. It's an ethic that demands a high level of maturity and commitment to others. If this world is all we have, then what we do in it matters even more. If there's no cosmic system judging our actions, then we're the ones who must create standards of justice, dignity, and solidarity. The freedom of living without appeal comes with the obligation to not betray our own awareness. Every decision becomes a serious existential act. Camus writes, "Freedom has value only when lived with responsibility, and that applies to every part of life. How we choose to treat people, the social causes we decide to support, how we take a stand against injustice, the relationships we nurture, the work and projects we dedicate our time and energy to. Living without appeal also means letting go of easy excuses. We can no longer say, 'It was fate, God wanted it this way,' or 'the circumstances forced me.' Every act is a signature of our freedom. Every omission, too. Camus suggests we shouldn't see this personal responsibility as a burden, but as a privilege of being human. If we're the only creators of our meaning, then every small choice can become an act of life affirmation. Camus also highlights that living without appeal is a form of radical honesty. It's about looking at the world exactly as it is, without filters, without comforting illusions, and still choosing to say yes to existence. It's recognizing that life is limited, fragile, unfair at times, and still deciding it's worth living with courage and integrity. This responsibility to create your own meaning is also a source of power. It reminds us that we're not doomed to repeat patterns, to live on autopilot, or to follow inherited values without reflection. Every moment can be the start of a new way of living. Every decision can be a fresh affirmation of freedom. Camus pushes us to be more aware, more attentive, and more committed to the present, especially because there are no guarantees that tomorrow will come to fix our mistakes or make up for our inaction. He writes, "To be nothing, to expect nothing, and yet to act, that is true freedom." At the end of the day, living without appeal is about choosing to stay awake. It's about taking responsibility for your own life, your own actions, even your own failures. It's about accepting that even without ultimate meaning, human dignity can and should be built by our own hands, every single day. So here's the final challenge. Are you willing to live without appeal? To create your own meaning with honesty, responsibility, and courage? Camus would bet you are, because according to him, that's the only authentic way to live in the face of the absurd. There's a subtle but profound difference between having hope and living with integrity. For Albert Camus, that difference is essential. Throughout his philosophy of the absurd, Camus offers us a bold invitation to let go of false hopes that only serve as existential anesthesia. But what exactly does he mean by that? In a world without ultimate meaning, it's natural for people to seek comfort somewhere. The pain of living in an indifferent universe, knowing that death is certain and that there are no metaphysical guarantees, pushes many toward the temptation of creating artificial hopes. Some project this hope onto an afterlife, others onto a future political utopia. Some cling to religious or philosophical promises that somehow everything will make sense in the end. But Camus rejects all of these escapes. For him, hope, understood as the expectation of future meaning or metaphysical redemption, is just another way of running from the reality of the absurd. He writes in the myth of Sisyphus, "Hope is the denial of revolt." That may sound harsh. After all, in many cultures, hope is seen as a virtue, something that gives us strength to keep going. But Camus offers a different perspective. Real strength comes from refusing to lie to ourselves. Living with integrity, according to Camus, means choosing clarity over comforting illusions. It means accepting the world exactly as it is. No masks, no promises of redemption, no expectation that suffering will magically find meaning in the future. This rejection isn't an invitation to pessimism or apathy. In fact, Camus sees the denial of hope as a higher form of existential courage. He suggests that by giving up on metaphysical expectations, we make room for a more authentic, more present, and more ethical life. Rejecting false hope means accepting that life's meaning won't come from outside. We must create it from within. That the justice we long for won't arrive in some final judgment, but will only exist through our actions, here and now. That relief from pain won't come from some future paradise, but from solidarity with others, from art, and from fighting for a less unjust world, even if we know the final victory will never be absolute. This mindset demands a rare kind of integrity. Camus urges us not to negotiate with the absurd, not to bargain with promises of some afterlife. He writes, "True generosity toward the future consists in giving everything to the present." That single sentence sums up the spirit of living without false hope. Instead of putting life on hold while waiting for a better tomorrow, Camus challenges us to live the present with intensity and responsibility. Every ethical gesture, every choice, every moment of love or creativity should be lived as if it were unique, because it really is. Living with integrity also means accepting our finiteness. It's about facing death without panic, but also without denial. It's understanding that time is limited, and that's exactly why each moment is too precious to waste on comforting illusions. Camus calls this mindset fidelity to the earth. Instead of looking to the heavens for answers, he says we should focus on the real world, the people around us, and the responsibilities right in front of us. This fidelity to the earth is an ethics of the concrete, an ethics that refuses to justify present suffering with promises of some future happiness that may never come. Camus sees this as a form of radical honesty. Stop lying to ourselves. Stop creating metaphysical excuses to delay real life. Rejecting false hope also makes us more aware of the world's injustices. When we don't believe that some god or cosmic force will correct inequality after death, we take responsibility for acting against it here and now. This is one of the biggest ethical lessons in Camus' philosophy. If life is absurd, then our ethical actions become even more urgent, more essential. In this sense, denying hope is about choosing active engagement with life. It's about living with integrity, knowing that every choice we make is a testimony to our freedom and our existential responsibility. Camus writes in The Rebel, "The absurd man does not despair, he lives with full awareness of his condition." This awareness doesn't paralyze. On the contrary, it frees. By letting go of false hopes, we gain the inner space to build a more authentic life, one that's more connected to the present and more attentive to others. In Camus' view, rejecting hope isn't an act of despair, it's an act of life affirmation. It's choosing to live with clarity, courage, and ethics. No waiting for miracles, no waiting for answers that won't come. Just the decision to live with integrity in every second we're given. So here's the reflection. How many of your choices are based on false hopes? And how many come from a clear, honest awareness of reality? Camus would challenge us to always choose the second, because in the end, it's in our integrity, in the face of the absurd, that we find the most authentic form of freedom. Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, two names often mentioned side by side, representing a generation shaped by war, human suffering, and the search for meaning in a broken world. But even though their paths crossed and both wrestled with similar existential anxieties, Camus and Sartre were never truly part of the same philosophical school. While Sartre is closely tied to existentialism, Camus built his own path, Absurdism, and understanding this difference is key to not confusing their ideas. Both Sartre and Camus start from a similar diagnosis. Human existence is marked by anxiety, ontological loneliness, and the absence of metaphysical guarantees. Both recognize that the universe is indifferent, that God is absent or dead, and that humans are thrown into a world without any preset purpose. But this is where their paths begin to diverge. Sartre's philosophy starts with the famous idea that existence precedes essence. This means we're not born with a defined nature or destiny. We're thrown into the world, free and condemned to choose. This freedom, for Sartre, is inescapable. Whether we like it or not, we're always choosing, either consciously or by default. For Sartre, not choosing is already a choice. He calls this the human condition, and it comes with absolute responsibility. We are entirely responsible for everything we do and for who we become. Sartre's existentialism is therefore a philosophy of action. Even without ultimate meaning, humans must create meaning through their choices. Camus also acknowledges human freedom, but he sees it as less of a metaphysical burden. For Camus, freedom is a consequence of becoming aware of the absurd. While Sartre says we must create meaning to fill the void, Camus argues we can live fully without inventing or believing in any absolute or transcendent meaning. Here lies one of the biggest differences. Sartre says, create your own meaning as a solution to the existential void. Camus says, live within the void, with dignity, without forcing meaning where none exists. The absurd man, in Camus' terms, doesn't seek to justify his existence. He accepts the absurd and chooses to live lucidly, defiantly, and passionately, without trying to reshape the world into something it's not. Camus writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The absurd man expects nothing. He lives without appeal." That's one of their biggest philosophical splits. Another key difference is how each philosopher approached political action and social engagement. Sartre, especially after World War II, became a vocal supporter of radical political involvement. He believed that humans, in creating their own meaning, had a moral duty to engage politically and work to transform reality, even if that meant supporting morally questionable regimes at times. For a while, Sartre even sympathized with totalitarian regimes like Stalinism, believing that revolution was necessary for a more just world. Camus never accepted that position. For him, no cause, no matter how just it seems, could ever justify murder or the oppression of human beings. His ethics were always rooted in moderation, limits, and a clear refusal of blind violence. Camus writes in The Rebel, "There is no cause so just that it justifies the killing of an innocent life." This difference became so sharp that it ended their friendship. Camus accused Sartre of justifying the unjustifiable in the name of abstract ideals, while Sartre saw Camus as politically naive or ineffective. Where Sartre ends his reflections with a call to engagement and meaning-making, Camus ends with the affirmation of the absurd and the need to live without illusions. Sartre wants to transform reality, to shape it through free human choices. Camus wants to accept reality as it is and argues that the greatest form of resistance is living with wholeness, even when faced with an unsolvable absurdity. While Sartre comes across as more idealistic and action-driven, Camus is more pragmatic, ethical, and existentially humble. Camus doesn't try to solve the absurd, he chooses to live it. Both Sartre and Camus offer philosophies of courage, but with very different existential temperaments. Sartre says, create your meaning, engage, transform the world. Camus replies, accept the absurd, live with clarity, affirm life without expecting guarantees. In the end, choosing between them says a lot about the kind of existence you're willing to live. So here's the reflection. Are you more drawn to Camus' quiet, lucid revolt, or Sartre's militant, world-changing engagement? Both paths require courage. Both require responsibility. But the choice, that's entirely yours. Well, if you've made it this far, it means you've had the courage to face questions that most people prefer to avoid. These were heavy reflections, sometimes uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary. Camus' philosophy doesn't offer easy comfort or quick solutions. Instead, It invites us to look at life as it really is, with no guarantees, no ultimate meaning, but still full of possible choices. And that's the biggest takeaway. Each of us is responsible for what we do with our own time and our own freedom. If any of these ideas made you stop and think, if at any point during this video you really pause to reflect on how you've been living your life, then I'm going to ask you, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't hand out ready-made answers, but we promise to keep asking the questions that really matter. If this content made sense to you, hit the like button. It helps the channel reach more people who are also looking to reflect more deeply. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear this. Maybe someone close to you is going through their own period of questioning right now. And of course, leave a comment down below. I want to know, what stood out the most for you? Which part hit you the hardest? What topics would you like to see in future videos? There's already a lot of content here on the channel, so stick around, pick the next video, and let's keep this conversation going. And above all, thank you so much for staying with me until the end. And always remember, living with awareness isn't easy, but it's what makes life truly worth it. See you next time.